big city and, over time, turned away from the woman who saved his life and raised him in poverty. Years passed, their connection nearly disappeared, and he had no idea that fate was preparing an unexpected turn that would change everything and force him to look at his past, at himself, and at the woman he once abandoned in a completely different way. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. Morning always came quietly to the small plot of land by the highway. Before the sun fully rose above the flat horizon, before the steady stream of cars turned into a roaring river of sound, the air remained almost tender. Dew lay thick on the leaves, clinging to them like tiny, fragile jewels, and the soil still held the cool breath of night. It was at this hour that Marta was already awake. She moved slowly among the narrow rows of vegetables, careful not to rush her body, which no longer forgave sudden movements. Her dark skin, weathered by decades of sun and wind, carried the fine map of her life in lines and creases. Her fingers, stiff with age and aching joints, wrapped gently around each cucumber as if it were something delicate, something that could be harmed by carelessness. She twisted them from the vine with practiced ease, laid them into the woven basket at her feet, and paused now and then to straighten her back, pressing a hand against it until the pain dulled to something manageable. The basket was old, patched in two places with twine of a slightly different color, repaired years ago when replacing it had felt unnecessary and wasteful. Everything around Marta bore the same quiet marks of endurance. The small knife she carried in her apron pocket had lost its shine long ago, the blade sharpened countless times on the same stone. Her faded hat, wide-brimmed and soft, had once been a deep brown. Now it was the color of dust and sunlight. Beyond the last row of tomatoes, the road stretched out like a hard, gray scar across the land. At this early hour, cars passed only occasionally, their engines distant and brief, disappearing as quickly as they arrived. Marta always noticed them, even when she pretended not to. The road was both a boundary and a reminder. On one side stood her life, the small house, the garden, the rhythm of seasons measured in harvests and frost. On the other side rushed lives she would never touch, carried forward by speed and purpose, by destinations she could only imagine. She worked steadily, her movements shaped by years of repetition. The smell of damp earth rose around her, grounding her in a familiarity that required no thought. There was comfort in this labor. Even pain carried a certain honesty. Plants responded to care in simple ways. You watered them, you protected them, you waited. They did not pretend to be anything other than what they were. By the time the sun climbed higher, Marta's basket was nearly full. She wiped her hands on her apron and allowed herself a moment of stillness. Standing there, she looked toward the road, shading her eyes slightly. She did this every morning, almost without realizing it. There was no clear expectation attached to the gesture, no conscious hope. And yet, somewhere beneath the habit, something in her always listened for a sound that might stand out from the rest. Her small house stood a short distance behind her, set back from the road just enough to give an illusion of separation. The roof was newer than the walls, replaced not long ago after one too many winters had forced rain through the old boards. The fence leaned in places, though it was sturdy where it mattered. Inside, everything had its place. Not because the house was neat in any polished sense, but because order made life easier when strength was limited. Marta lived alone. That fact had become so deeply woven into her days that she rarely named it. Loneliness was not something she allowed herself to examine too closely. There were tasks to complete, meals to prepare, bills to track in the small notebook she kept tucked inside a kitchen drawer. Each expense was written in careful handwriting, numbers rounded and checked twice. She never bought more than she needed. Medicines were measured out with the same restraint, taken exactly as prescribed, no sooner and no later. Later in the morning, she would carry her vegetables to the small stand she set up by the roadside. A simple wooden table, worn smooth at the edges, shaded by a patchwork canopy she had sewn herself. She arranged the produce carefully, wiping away excess dirt, lining everything up so it looked inviting without being extravagant. Marta knew the value of appearances. People were more willing to stop if the table looked cared for, if the person behind it seemed steady and honest. The customers varied. Some slowed only enough to glance, then sped away. Others stopped briefly, exchanged a few words, handed over coins without much thought. There were those who bargained aggressively, as if shaving a few cents off the price mattered more than the dignity of the person standing before them. Marta never argued. She simply stated the price again, calmly. If they walked away, they walked away. Pride was a quiet thing with her, but it was firm. As she worked that morning, she noticed the familiar dull ache in her knees and the stiffness creeping into her shoulders. Age made itself known in these small, persistent ways. Still, she did not complain. Complaints, she believed, only made pain louder. Instead, she adjusted her pace and continued. Occasionally, her thoughts drifted where she did not invite them. To the past, to the boy she had raised, whose absence shaped the empty spaces in her life more than she admitted. There was an old photograph tucked into the frame of a mirror inside the house. It showed him as a teenager, standing awkwardly with one hand in his pocket, trying not to smile too openly. Marta had not moved that photo in years. Dust gathered around it, but never on it. She wiped it clean every week. She did not speak his name aloud often. Names carried weight, and hers carried memory. She knew where he was, at least in broad terms. A city far larger than this place. A life far more complex. She told herself he was busy, that success demanded attention and sacrifice. Mothers, she believed, were meant to make themselves small in the face of their children's futures. When the first car of the morning slowed near her stand, Marta's attention returned fully to the present. A man stepped out, stretching his legs, glancing at the produce. She greeted him with a nod, nothing more. He selected a few tomatoes, paid without comment, and drove on. The rhythm of the day resumed. As the hours passed, the road grew louder. Trucks thundered by, rattling the table and shaking the leaves of the nearby trees. Marta adjusted the canopy ropes when the wind picked up, her fingers working carefully with knots she had learned long ago. She watched the road between customers, a habit so ingrained it no longer surprised her. It was some time after midday, when the sun stood high and unforgiven, that she felt it. Not a sound exactly, not yet. More like a tightening in her chest, a subtle shift in the air that made her lift her head. Among the passing vehicles, one shape lingered in her vision, longer than the rest. A dark car, slowing slightly before continuing on. She told herself it meant nothing. Many cars passed every day, yet her gaze followed it until it disappeared into the distance. Her hands, which had been sorting herbs, paused for a moment before resuming their work. Marta finished the day as she always did. She packed away what remained unsold, counted her earnings carefully, folded the canopy with deliberate care. The walk back to the house was short, but she took it slowly, savoring the relative quiet once the evening traffic thinned. Inside, she prepared a simple meal and ate alone at the small table near the window. The light softened as the sun dipped lower, painting the walls in warm tones that reminded her, fleetingly, of evenings long past when the house had held more than one presence. Before bed, she stepped onto the porch. The road lay quiet again, stretched beneath a sky beginning to darken. She sat down, resting her hands in her lap, and allowed herself to look for a long moment. The world felt suspended, as if holding its breath. She did not know it then, but the stillness of that evening was the last of its kind. The road that had carried so many strangers past her life was slowly, inexorably, preparing to bring her past back to her doorstep. That night, as Marta lay in her narrow bed, sleep did not come easily. The quiet that usually wrapped around her after sunset felt heavier, filled with a sense of anticipation she could not explain. The distant hum of the road drifted through the open window, blending with the steady rhythm of her breathing. Somewhere between wakefulness and memory, her thoughts began to move backward, pulled by a force older than habit. The road outside, so familiar and ordinary now, slowly transformed in her mind into the road of many years ago, the one that had changed her life forever. She had been younger then, though even at that time life had already carved its share of lines into her face. It was late afternoon, the sun low and sharp when she was returning from the market with a small bag of groceries balanced against her hip. The road had been quieter in those days, less traveled, more forgiving. She remembered the heat pressing down on her shoulders and the dull ache in her legs, the familiar calculations running through her mind about what could be stretched until the end of the week. At first, she thought the sound was an animal, a weak, broken cry carried by the wind, barely noticeable over the rustle of dry grass. Marta had stopped, uncertain, her heart tightening in a way she could not yet name. She had taken a few steps toward the ditch at the side of the road, peering down through the weeds and dust. The sound came again, sharper this time, unmistakably human. The bundle lay half hidden near the edge of the ditch, wrapped in a thin, worn blanket that looked as though it had once been white. Marta remembered how her breath had caught, how her hands had begun to tremble even before she understood what she was seeing. The world had seemed to narrow around that small shape, everything else fading into irrelevance. She had knelt without thinking, setting her groceries aside. The child's face was red and strained, his tiny fists clenched, his cries hoarse as if he had already spent all his strength. Marta remembered touching his cheek, surprised by the warmth of his skin, by the undeniable reality of him. Fear had surged then, fast and sharp. Fear of what this meant, of the responsibility suddenly placed in her hands, of the consequences she could not foresee. For a moment, she had considered walking away, not because she wanted to, but because the weight of the decision pressed down on her with crushing force. She was alone. She was poor. She was already tired. Questions raced through her mind, each more frightening than the last. Who had left him? Why? What if someone accused her? What if she could not protect him? But even as these thoughts swirled, her body betrayed her hesitation. She lifted the child carefully, cradling him against her chest. The crying softened, then faded into quiet, broken breaths. In that instant, something inside her settled into place, firm and unyielding. Whatever the cost, she could not put him back down. The walk home felt longer than usual. Marta moved cautiously, shielding the child from the sun, her steps guided by instinct more than reason. Each passing car made her tense, half expecting someone to stop, to question her, to demand explanations she did not yet have. Inside her small house, she laid him on the bed and stood there for a long time, simply watching him breathe. The house, which had always felt sufficient, suddenly seemed too quiet, too empty. That first night passed in fragments. She fed him with what little she had, improvised warmth, and stayed awake long after exhaustion begged her to rest. The days that followed blurred together in her memory, but certain moments remained painfully clear. The visit to the local authorities, her voice steady even as her hands shook. The suspicious looks, the questions asked again and again. The paperwork she barely understood, filled with words that felt heavy and permanent. She answered everything honestly, knowing that lies would only make things worse. There were whispers in the town. People noticed, of course. A dark-skinned woman with a light-skinned baby raised eyebrows and fueled speculation. Some offered help in cautious ways, others kept their distance. Marta endured it all quietly. She did not argue or defend herself more than necessary. Her focus narrowed to the child and the fragile new life forming around him. The process of making it official took time. Weeks turned into months of uncertainty. Marta lived with the constant fear that someone would come and take him away. Each knock at the door made her heart race. Yet she persisted, attending every appointment, signing every form, standing her ground with a calm determination that surprised even herself. When the final papers were signed, when she was told that the child was legally hers, Marta felt something close to disbelief. She walked home that day carrying him as she always did, but the world looked different, brighter, sharper. The weight on her shoulders remained, but it had shifted, anchored now by purpose rather than fear. Raising him was not easy. Money grew tighter, time more precious. Marta learned to sleep lightly, to work while holding him close, to measure days and feedings and small milestones. She took on extra work whenever she could, sewing late into the night, cleaning houses in the early morning hours before tending to her garden. Yet, alongside the exhaustion came moments of profound, unexpected joy. The first time he smiled at her, wide and unguarded, she felt something in her chest loosen that she had not known was tight. When he took his first steps across the uneven floor of the house, she laughed out loud, startling herself with the sound. His presence filled the spaces she had never admitted were empty. As he grew, the differences between them became more visible. Strangers asked questions that cut deeper than they realized. Marta learned to answer simply, firmly, without apology. At home, she spoke to him of honesty and resilience, of work and dignity. She taught him that worth was not measured by appearances or possessions, but by how one treated others and oneself. There were nights when she lay awake, listening to his breathing from the small bed she had set up beside her own. On those nights, fear returned in quieter forms. She worried about what the world would say to him, about how it would see them together. She worried that one day he would look at her and see only what others pointed out as differences. Even as a child, he was perceptive. Marta noticed the way his eyes lingered on passing cars, on television images of cities and tall buildings. She saw curiosity bloom into something sharper, more restless. She did not discourage it. Love, she believed, was not about holding tightly, but about preparing someone to stand on their own. Years passed in this way, marked by seasons and small victories. The road remained just outside their door, unchanged and ever-present. It carried away dust and noise and strangers, and sometimes, as Marta watched it in the fading light, she felt a quiet premonition that it would one day carry her child away as well. She did not yet know how deeply that truth would cut, or how long it would take to find its way back to her. The boy grew quickly, as if trying to outrun the narrow boundaries of the life that surrounded him. Marta noticed it first in small, almost unremarkable ways. His shoes wore out faster than she expected. His clothes seemed too short before she had time to replace them, and his questions became more complex, stretching beyond the simple answers she could once provide with ease. Childhood slipped past quietly, replaced by a sharp curiosity that refused to stay contained. School revealed what Marta had already sensed. He learned quickly, absorbing lessons with an intensity that surprised his teachers. Numbers came easily to him, words even more so. He read everything he could find: old textbooks, borrowed magazines, newspapers left behind by customers at the roadside stand. Marta watched him late in the evenings, bent over pages under the dim kitchen light, and felt a mixture of pride and unease. Pride because she saw his potential clearly. Unease because potential had a way of pulling people far from where they started. She did what she could to support him. Money was always scarce, but she rearranged her life around his education with quiet determination. She took on extra work when necessary, rising earlier and sleeping later. She learned which expenses could be postponed and which could not. School supplies appeared on the table when needed, even if it meant her own shoes had to last another season. She never spoke of these sacrifices. To her, they were simply part of being a mother. As he entered adolescence, the differences between him and his surroundings grew more pronounced. Other children talked about vacations, new gadgets, homes that seemed impossibly large. He learned early how to listen without revealing too much, how to smile and nod while keeping certain truths to himself. Marta noticed the subtle changes in his behavior. He became more private, more careful about what he shared. When classmates visited, he grew tense, watching their reactions to the small house, the garden, the road just beyond the fence. Marta pretended not to notice at first. She believed that drawing attention to his discomfort would only deepen it. Instead, she focused on what she could give him. She taught him to respect work, to finish what he started, to treat people kindly regardless of their status. She spoke to him about dignity, about the value of effort, about standing tall even when circumstances tried to push one down. These lessons were not delivered as lectures, but woven into daily life, into the way she carried herself and the choices she made. Despite her efforts, she could sense the growing distance between his inner world and hers. He dreamed aloud of the city, of places where opportunities were abundant and life seemed brighter. He spoke of tall buildings, of careers that sounded impressive even when she did not fully understand them. Marta listened carefully, encouraging his ambition while quietly bracing herself for what it might mean. The first real turning point came when his academic achievements began to attract attention beyond their small community. A teacher mentioned scholarships, programs that could open doors Marta had never imagined. The words sounded both hopeful and frightening. Marta nodded, asked practical questions, and went home with her mind racing. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, weighing possibilities she had never planned for. Preparing him for those opportunities required more than encouragement. It demanded resources she did not readily have. Marta began saving with renewed intensity, setting aside small amounts whenever possible. She sold produce in advance at lower prices, took on cleaning jobs in neighboring towns, and mended clothes late into the night to earn a few extra bills. Fatigue became a constant companion, but she ignored it, driven by the belief that this effort mattered. As his departure drew closer, the house seemed to shrink around them. Boxes appeared, filled with clothes and books. Marta washed and folded each item carefully, trying to make everything look as respectable as possible. She worried about how he would be perceived, whether his simple belongings would betray his origins. These thoughts embarrassed her, but she could not dismiss them. The day he left arrived with unsettling calm. There were no dramatic gestures, no tears that could not be explained away. They stood together near the bus stop, the road stretching endlessly behind him. Marta adjusted his collar, a gesture she had repeated since his childhood, and forced herself to smile. She told him to work hard, to stay honest, to remember where he came from. She did not tell him how afraid she was of the silence his absence would bring. As the bus pulled away, Marta remained standing until it disappeared from view. The road resumed its usual rhythm, cars passing without pause. She returned home alone, carrying his absence with her. The first weeks were the hardest. She caught herself setting aside food for him, listening for footsteps that would not come. Gradually, she adapted, filling the emptiness with work and routine. At first, he called often. His voice carried excitement and nervous energy, stories of new places and challenges. Marta listened eagerly, holding the phone close as if it could bridge the distance between them. She celebrated his successes quietly, marking them as victories they shared. Each call felt like reassurance that the bond between them remained intact. Over time, the calls grew shorter. His schedule became busier, his tone more distant. Marta told herself this was natural, that independence required space. She resisted the urge to call more often, unwilling to burden him. When she did speak to him, she focused on encouragement, careful not to express her loneliness. She noticed changes when he returned home during breaks. His clothes were different, his manner more reserved. He spoke less freely, choosing his words with care. He seemed uncomfortable lingering in familiar places, as if afraid they might cling to him. Marta sensed his unease and tried to make his visits pleasant, cooking his favorite meals, keeping the house as neat as possible. Despite these efforts, an invisible barrier had formed between them. Marta could feel it but did not know how to address it. She feared that acknowledging it would only widen the gap. Instead, she held on to the belief that time would soften these changes, that once he found his footing, he would return to her with gratitude rather than discomfort. As the years passed, his ambitions took clearer shape. He spoke of careers that promised stability and recognition, of networks and connections Marta could barely imagine. She nodded, proud of his drive, even as a quiet ache settled in her chest. She wondered whether there would still be room for her in the life he envisioned. When news came of an opportunity that could change everything, Marta understood its significance immediately. Acceptance into a prestigious program, support that would propel him forward. The excitement in his voice was unmistakable. Marta responded with enthusiasm, congratulating him wholeheartedly. Only later, alone, did she allow herself to feel the weight of what this meant. The preparations intensified. Documents were gathered, plans made. Marta assisted wherever she could, navigating unfamiliar processes with determination. Each step forward felt like a step away from her. She reminded herself that this was what she wanted for him, what she had worked toward for years. On the morning of his departure for the city that would become his new home, the sky was overcast, heavy with unspoken emotion. Marta accompanied him part of the way, carrying his bag until he insisted on taking it himself. They exchanged a final embrace, brief but sincere. She watched him walk toward his future, standing still until he was out of sight. The road, faithful in its role, carried him away. Marta returned to her routines, tending the garden, setting up her stand, counting coins at the end of each day. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. She did not yet know that this distance, born of ambition and hope, would soon harden into something far more painful. For now, she clung to the memory of his earlier calls, his laughter, the promise she believed still lived between them. The dreams that carried him forward were already reshaping the path that connected them, quietly, inexorably, leading toward a separation neither of them fully understood. The distance between them did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, almost politely, disguised as progress, responsibility, and the natural course of growing up. In the beginning, Marta told herself that nothing essential had changed. Her son was simply building his life exactly as she had hoped he would. The fact that his days were now filled with schedules she did not understand and places she could not picture seemed a small price to pay for his success. During the first year after his move, his presence still lived vividly in her daily routine. He called often, sometimes late in the evening when the city noise hummed faintly behind his voice. He spoke quickly, eagerly, telling her about his studies, about the people he met, about opportunities that sounded vast and unreal. Marta listened with full attention, sitting at the kitchen table with the phone pressed to her ear, afraid to miss even a single word. After each call, she would remain there for a while, holding the silence, replaying his voice in her mind as if it could sustain her until the next time. When he came home during holidays, she prepared for days in advance. She scrubbed the house from top to bottom, even the corners no one ever noticed. She cooked his favorite dishes, waking early to ensure everything was perfect. She tried to make the house look less worn, less small, arranging things carefully, hiding what she could not fix. When he arrived, she studied his face with a mixture of joy and concern, noting how much he had changed in such a short time. At first, the changes were subtle. His clothes were newer, his posture more confident. He spoke with a different rhythm, one shaped by conversations Marta was not part of. He laughed less freely in the house, as if measuring himself against its walls. Still, he was kind to her, respectful, careful not to hurt her feelings. Marta told herself that this restraint was a sign of maturity. As time passed, those visits became shorter. Sometimes he arrived already tired, distracted by messages and calls he stepped outside to answer. Marta noticed how his eyes lingered on the peeling paint, the uneven floor, the garden that had once seemed so alive to him. He did not complain, but his discomfort hung in the air like an unspoken accusation. She responded by trying harder. She dressed more carefully when he visited, choosing her cleanest clothes, smoothing her hair in the mirror until it lay just right. She spoke less about her own life, sensing that her routines now bored him. Eventually, even these visits grew rare. There were always reasons, work obligations, travel, important meetings that could not be postponed. Marta accepted each explanation without protest. She told herself that success demanded sacrifice, that he would come back when things settled down. She did not ask him to choose between her and his ambitions. She had already made her choice long ago. The phone calls began to change as well. They grew shorter, more formal. He asked about her health, her garden, the weather, ticking off questions as if fulfilling a duty. Marta answered honestly but briefly, careful not to sound needy. She learned to recognize the moments when his attention drifted, when his replies came a second too late, shaped by distractions she could not see. Money transfers started arriving regularly at first. Marta never asked for them, but she accepted them with quiet gratitude. They helped ease the constant tension of making ends meet. She used them responsibly, paying bills, buying better food when she could. She did not mention how much they meant to her, fearing that gratitude might feel like pressure. Over time, the transfers became smaller, less frequent. Eventually, they stopped altogether. Marta noticed, of course. She noticed everything. But she said nothing. Pride and understanding intertwined in her silence. She told herself that he had new responsibilities, that she should not burden him with expectations. She adjusted her budget accordingly, returning to stricter habits, stretching every dollar as she had before. The real break came without drama. There was no argument, no harsh words exchanged. 1 week passed without a call, then another. Marta waited, resisting the urge to reach out first. She did not want to interrupt his life, did not want to remind him of obligations he might already resent. When she finally did call, the conversation felt strained. He sounded distracted, almost impatient. Afterward, she sat alone at the table, staring at the silent phone, and understood that something essential had shifted. From that point on, contact dwindled into near-nothingness. Occasional messages arrived on holidays, brief and impersonal. Marta replied warmly, always the same way, never hinting at hurt. She learned to live with the absence, folding it into her days as she had folded everything else. Her life narrowed again to its familiar boundaries. The garden, the stand by the road, the slow rhythm of seasons passing. Physical labor grew more difficult as her body aged, but she adapted. She worked more carefully, took more breaks. Neighbors offered help from time to time, and she accepted it when refusal would have been foolish, though she never relied on it. In the evenings, she returned to her porch, watching the road as she always had. Cars passed, carrying strangers toward unknown destinations. Sometimes she imagined her son among them, moving through his world with confidence and purpose. She hoped he was happy. That hope became her quiet companion, even as it carried a faint ache. Years passed in this way, each one layering silence upon silence. Marta aged visibly, though she remained strong in her own way. Her hands grew stiffer, her back more curved. Still, she rose each morning before dawn, tended her land, and earned her living with dignity. She did not complain, did not ask why things had turned out this way. Questions, she believed, rarely brought peace. Then, one afternoon, something unusual happened. A car she did not recognize slowed near her stand, then stopped completely. A man stepped out, sharply dressed, his shoes too clean for the dusty roadside. He looked out of place, glancing around as if uncertain whether he had arrived at the correct destination. Marta watched him approach, her posture cautious but composed. He introduced himself politely, asking her name, confirming details that made her uneasy. He spoke of documents, of family connections long forgotten. His words sounded unreal, disconnected from the life she knew. As he spoke, Marta felt a faint chill despite the warmth of the day. The road, which had carried so much away from her, now seemed poised to deliver something back. She did not yet understand what it was, only that this encounter marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. That evening, as she sat alone on her porch, the silence felt different. Charged. The break that had once separated her from her son had carved a space in her life, and now, slowly, Something was beginning to move within it. The man returned 2 days later, exactly as he had promised. Marta recognized the dark car the moment it turned off the road and rolled slowly toward her house, its tires crunching softly over gravel and dry soil. This time, she was not startled, yet a quiet tension settled in her chest all the same. She wiped her hands on her apron before stepping forward, her movements calm, measured, betraying none of the uncertainty that stirred beneath the surface. He introduced himself again, more formally, and asked if they could speak inside. Marta hesitated only a moment before nodding. The house, modest and worn, offered little protection from truths that seemed far larger than its walls, but it was hers, and she faced the situation with the same dignity she brought to everything else. They sat at the small kitchen table where she had eaten countless solitary meals. The man opened a leather folder, its edges sharp and unscuffed, and began to explain. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, as if afraid that speaking too plainly might shatter something fragile. He mentioned a name Marta had not heard spoken aloud in decades. A distant cousin, her mother's sister's son, a man who had left the country many years ago during a time when leaving felt final and unforgiving. At first, the name meant little. Marta frowned, searching her memory, and then fragments surfaced. Letters written in uneven handwriting, postmarked from far away. Stories whispered by relatives long gone. A young man who had dreamed of something larger than the narrow opportunities of their shared past. She remembered how the letters had eventually stopped, how life had filled the silence without explanation. The man continued, explaining that the cousin had died unexpectedly. He spoke of businesses, of success built over decades, of assets and legal matters that needed resolution. Marta listened without interrupting, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Much of what he said seemed distant, unreal, like a story meant for someone else. It was only when he spoke her name in connection with the word heir that the air in the room shifted. She asked him to repeat himself. He did, his voice steady, patient. According to the documents, she was the closest living relative. There were no children, no spouse, no other claimants. Everything had been arranged legally, meticulously. The inheritance was substantial, more than substantial. The number he mentioned felt absurd, disconnected from reality, impossible to reconcile with the life she knew. Marta did not react the way the man might have expected. She did not gasp or smile or ask what she should buy. Instead, she grew very still. Her mind resisted the information, instinctively searching for explanations that would return the world to its familiar shape. She asked careful questions, practical ones. She wanted to know how he had found her, how he could be certain, what proof existed. The following weeks unfolded in a blur of appointments and documents. Marta traveled to the city more times than she had in years, sitting in offices that smelled of polished wood and unfamiliar confidence. She listened to lawyers and notaries explain processes that seemed designed to confuse. Each step confirmed the same impossible truth. The inheritance was real. When the money finally appeared in her account, Marta stared at the numbers for a long time, unable to connect them to meaning. They sat there, neat and exact, offering no guidance on how to feel. She withdrew a small amount, just enough to test reality, half expecting something to go wrong. Nothing did. Word did not spread, not because Marta worked to conceal it, but because she changed so little that there was nothing to notice. She replaced the roof before winter came, choosing practical materials over anything impressive. She repaired the fence where it leaned most dangerously, and fix the wiring that had flickered for years. These changes blended seamlessly into the existing landscape of her life. The rest of the money remained untouched. Marta did not rush to improve her situation beyond what necessity demanded. Wealth, she felt, was loud, and she had lived too long and quiet to embrace it easily. More importantly, she feared what it might awaken in others. She had seen how desire altered faces, how money bent relationships into unfamiliar shapes. Her thoughts returned, again and again, to her son. The urge to call him surged unexpectedly, rising like a wave that threatened to carry her forward before she could stop herself. She imagined his voice, the surprise, the questions. She imagined his sudden interest, his concern, his promises to visit. Each imagined conversation left her unsettled. Something inside her urged caution. It was not bitterness, nor was it a desire for revenge. It was a quieter instinct, born of years spent observing human nature from the sidelines. Marta wanted to know who would come to her without incentive, who would remember her when she had nothing new to offer. She chose silence deliberately. She did not inform neighbors or relatives. She did not change her routine. She continued to rise before dawn, tend her garden, set up her stand by the road. Customers still saw the same woman selling vegetables, unaware that the coins they handed her meant far less than before. Marta accepted them anyway, valuing the exchange not for its necessity, but for its familiarity. At night, she sometimes lay awake, her mind circling questions she did not yet have answers for. What did responsibility mean when one suddenly possessed more than enough? How did one protect love from being distorted by abundance? She thought of her cousin, of the life he must have lived far away, and wondered what choices had shaped his final decision. Seasons passed, each marked by subtle changes in the land. Spring returned, generous and demanding. Marta planted as she always had, her hands trusting the earth. Summer brought heat and long days of labor. Autumn followed, heavy with harvest. Through it all, the inheritance remained a silent presence, neither celebrated nor denied. Occasionally, rumors brushed against her life without fully entering it. Someone mentioned a lawyer seen in the area. Someone else commented on the new roof. Marta responded politely, offering no explanations. The world, she had learned, rarely pressed for truths it did not already suspect. Her son remained absent. Months went by without contact. Marta marked holidays quietly, cooking meals meant for more than one person and then eating them alone. The pain of his absence had dulled over time, settling into something manageable. She no longer waited by the phone or strained to hear engines on the road, or so she told herself. One evening, as she closed her stand earlier than usual, she noticed a car parked farther down the road than most customers chose to stop. It remained there longer than necessary, the engine idling. Marta's heart beat faster, though she forced herself to continue packing her crates calmly. When she looked again, the car was gone. That night, she dreamed of the past and the future intertwining. She saw herself holding a child by the roadside, and then standing alone with fields stretching endlessly before her. She woke before dawn, unsettled, the sense of anticipation returning stronger than before. The money had changed nothing and everything at once. It had given her security, yes, but it had also opened a door she had not intended to approach. Marta sensed that the road, patient and relentless, was preparing to deliver another turning point. The silence that had once felt protective now seemed charged, as if waiting to be broken. She rose, dressed, and stepped outside as the sky began to lighten. The earth waited as it always did. Marta bent to her work, unaware that the quiet balance she had preserved so carefully was nearing its end. While Marta's life remained outwardly unchanged, shaped by soil, seasons, and silence, her son's world was unraveling far from the road that had raised him. For years, he had believed that movement alone meant progress, that distance from his beginnings was proof of success. The city had welcomed him with open doors at first, offering structure, ambition, and the intoxicating promise that effort would always be rewarded. He learned quickly how to belong. He adopted the language of meetings and deadlines, the rhythm of long days that blurred into restless nights. His appearance changed as his confidence grew. The careful restraint of his early years gave way to tailored suits, polished shoes, and an ease that came from knowing he was no longer overlooked. He stopped introducing himself as someone who had come from nowhere. Instead, he let people assume what they wanted. Opportunities followed. Promotions came faster than he had dared to hope. He was praised for his discipline, his adaptability, his hunger. These compliments reinforced a belief he had quietly nurtured for years, that he had escaped something, that he had outgrown the life he once knew. The memory of the small house by the road, the garden, the stand with its neatly arranged vegetables began to feel distant, almost unreal. As his income increased, so did his expectations. He moved into better apartments, surrounded himself with people who measured worth in visible success. Conversations shifted from ideas to acquisitions, from effort to image. He learned how easily admiration followed wealth, how quickly respect could be purchased with the right symbols. He did not question this at first. It felt like confirmation that he had chosen the right path. The first cracks appeared subtly, a project that required more investment than he could comfortably afford, a partnership that promised rapid returns but demanded risk. He reassured himself that boldness was necessary, that caution belonged to those content with mediocrity. The voices around him encouraged this thinking, praising ambition and dismissing doubt as weakness. He borrowed to expand, confident that success would erase the debt before it became burdensome. When initial results fell short, he doubled down, unwilling to accept anything that resembled retreat. Failure, he believed, was not an option. Too much of his identity rested on the image he had built. Personal relationships began to strain under this pressure. The woman he shared his life with admired his drive, but only as long as it aligned with stability and upward momentum. When his stress became constant, when his optimism grew brittle, she grew distant. Her family, whose approval he had worked so hard to earn, watched his risks with increasing skepticism. Then came the moment when the carefully constructed balance tipped beyond recovery. A major deal collapsed unexpectedly, dragging with it smaller commitments that depended on its success. Payments were missed, promises went unfulfilled, calls that once came eagerly now carried tension and accusation. The confidence that had once drawn people to him now seemed hollow. He spent sleepless nights staring at screens filled with numbers that refused to improve. Each morning brought new messages, each more urgent than the last. He told himself that this was temporary, that every success story included moments like this. But deep down, he felt the ground shifting beneath him. The collapse, when it finally came, was not dramatic. There were no sudden explosions, no single catastrophic event. Instead, there was a steady erosion of trust. Investors withdrew, creditors tightened their grip. The network he had relied upon thinned rapidly, leaving him isolated in ways he had not anticipated. As his financial situation deteriorated, so did his social standing. Invitations stopped arriving. Messages went unanswered. People who had once praised his vision now avoided eye contact. He learned how conditional admiration truly was. Without success to anchor it, he was invisible. The woman who had stood beside him through his ascent chose to leave when the uncertainty became too heavy. She did not accuse him or fight. She simply walked away, taking with her the last illusion of stability. Her family followed suit, closing ranks, cutting ties cleanly and efficiently. Alone in his apartment, now far too expensive for his circumstances, he confronted a silence unlike any he had known. It was not the quiet of early mornings by the road or evenings on a porch. It was an empty, echoing stillness that magnified every regret. He began selling possessions, first the unnecessary luxuries, then the items he had once considered symbols of achievement. Each sale felt like a small surrender. Eventually, even these measures were not enough. He faced debts he could no longer manage, obligations he could not escape. The future he had envisioned narrowed to survival, stripped of ambition and pride. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to remember where he had come from without dismissing it as irrelevant. Memories surfaced uninvited: the smell of soil after rain, the sound of Marta's footsteps in the kitchen early in the morning, the way she had looked at him when he spoke of his dreams, proud and afraid all at once. These recollections unsettled him, stirring emotions he had carefully buried beneath years of self-reinvention. Shame followed close behind. He thought of the calls he had not returned, the visits he had postponed indefinitely. He remembered how he had distanced himself from her world, how he had avoided acknowledging it in his own life. The realization that he had measured his worth by standards that crumbled so easily left him hollow. With few options remaining, he made the decision to leave the city. It was not framed as a return, not yet. He told himself it was temporary, a retreat to regroup. But even as he packed what little he had left, he knew that something deeper was pulling him back. The journey felt longer than it had years before. Each mile stripped away layers of the persona he had built. The closer he came to the familiar landscape, the heavier his chest grew. He wondered what he would find there, whether Marta would even want to see him after so much silence. When he finally turned onto the road he knew so well, time seemed to fold in on itself. The land looked unchanged, stubbornly persistent. The fields, the trees, the stretch of asphalt cutting through it all remained exactly as he remembered. It was he who had altered beyond recognition. He slowed as he approached the small plot by the roadside. The stand was there, modest and familiar, and behind it, bent over her work, stood Marta. Older, thinner perhaps, but unmistakably the woman who had raised him. The sight struck him with unexpected force, rooting him in place. He parked farther down the road than necessary, watching from a distance. He saw her movements, deliberate and steady, and felt a wave of guilt wash over him. She had continued living, continued working, while his life had surged and collapsed in spectacular fashion. For a long moment, he remained in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He was no longer the man who had left full of confidence and ambition. He was someone else now, stripped down to essentials he barely recognized. As he finally stepped out onto the road, dust rising beneath his shoes, he understood that whatever awaited him would not be easy. The fall had brought him here, back to the place he had once been so eager to leave, and for the first time in years he was no longer certain that leaving had ever truly been an escape. Ahead of him, Marta continued her work, unaware that the distance between them, stretched thin by time and pride, was about to collapse into a single, fragile moment. Marta sensed his presence before she saw him. There was a disturbance in the familiar rhythm of the afternoon, a subtle interruption that made her pause with her hands still buried in the leaves. The air felt heavier, as if the land itself had drawn a breath and was holding it. She straightened slowly, pressing her palm against her lower back, and turned toward the road. He stood there, a few steps away from the edge of her plot, uncertain where to place himself. The man before her carried the outline of her son, but time and hardship had reshaped him. His clothes were neat but worn, chosen carefully rather than confidently. The ease he once carried was gone, replaced by something more fragile. His posture betrayed a hesitation she had never seen in him before. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Marta did not rush forward, nor did she retreat. She remained where she was, her hands resting at her sides, her expression unreadable. The road hummed faintly behind him, but the sound seemed distant, irrelevant. He took a step closer, then stopped again, as if unsure of his welcome. The silence between them stretched, dense with years left unspoken. Marta studied his face with the quiet attention she had once given him as a child, searching for signs she could trust. She saw exhaustion etched into his features, and something else beneath it, raw and unguarded. She did not open her arms. She did not ask questions. Instead, she bent once more to her work, lifting a basket and continuing to harvest the vegetables she had been gathering when he arrived. The gesture was not dismissive. It was deliberate. Life, she was telling him without words, did not stop simply because he had returned. He remained there, watching her movements, unsure how to interpret them. The urge to speak rose and fell within him, tangled with shame and fear. Finally, he moved closer, careful not to intrude, and stood at the edge of the row. He waited. Minutes passed. The sun dipped lower, softening the harsh light of the afternoon. Marta worked steadily, her breathing even. When the basket was full, she lifted it and turned toward the shed. Without looking at him, she set it down and gestured toward the empty space beside her. He understood the invitation instinctively. He removed his jacket, folded it carefully, and placed it aside. His hands hesitated over the plants, unfamiliar with the work. He watched her for a moment, then tried to imitate her movements, clumsy but earnest. They worked in silence. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves, the distant passing of cars, and the uneven rhythm of his breath as he bent and straightened again and again. His hands fumbled, breaking a stem where it should have been twisted cleanly. He winced, glancing at Marta to see if she had noticed. She had, but she said nothing, simply adjusted the plant and continued. Hours passed this way, marked only by the slow shift of light and the growing pile of filled baskets. Sweat darkened his shirt, and his muscles ached in ways he had forgotten were possible. Still, he did not stop. Each movement felt like a small act of penance, though he did not yet know if it would ever be enough. When the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Marta finally straightened and wiped her hands on her apron. She motioned toward the house, and he followed, exhaustion weighing down his steps. Inside, she poured water into 2 glasses and set one in front of him. He drank gratefully, the simple act grounding him in a way nothing else had. That evening, he did not leave. He slept on the narrow couch in the living room, the same one he had outgrown years ago. The house felt smaller than he remembered, but also sturdier, as if it had endured more than he ever knew. Lying there in the dark, he listened to the familiar creaks and settled noises, memories pressing in from all sides. Sleep came fitfully. Days followed, quiet and demanding. He stayed, rising early to help her, learning again the rhythm of a life he had once dismissed. He repaired what he could, mended what was broken, and accepted correction without resentment. Marta watched him closely, her judgment suspended but alert. She noted how he did not complain, how he returned to tasks even when fatigue weighed heavily on him. They spoke little. Words, she believed, could be shaped too easily to suit a purpose. Actions told a clearer story. She tested him without cruelty, assigning him the heaviest work on the hottest days, asking him to handle customers who were impatient or dismissive. She observed how he responded, whether pride or frustration surfaced. Each time, he met the moment with quiet resolve. In the evenings, they shared simple meals. Marta cooked as she always had, without embellishment. He ate without comment, grateful for nourishment that felt earned rather than provided. He washed dishes, swept floors, and listened when she spoke of small things. He did not interrupt or redirect the conversation to himself. Gradually, the tension in the house eased. The silence between them shifted, losing its sharp edges. Marta allowed herself small gestures of familiarity. She left his favorite fruit on the table, adjusted his jacket when he forgot it outside, corrected his posture in the garden as she once had. Each gesture was tentative, offered and withdrawn without expectation. Inside him, something changed. The work stripped away the last remnants of the life he had lost, leaving him exposed to a truth he could no longer avoid. He saw now the cost of what he had taken for granted, the strength required to sustain a life like this year after year. He understood, with painful clarity, how little he had given in return. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, he faltered. His movements slowed, his shoulders sagged. Marta noticed immediately. She did not scold him or offer comfort. She simply paused, met his eyes briefly, and then returned to her task. The message was clear. Rest would come, but only after the work was done. By the time the season began to turn, Marta felt something within herself shift as well. The caution that had governed her actions since his return began to soften. She still held back the truth of her inheritance, aware of how easily it could change everything. She wanted to be certain that his presence was not conditional, that he had not returned merely because he had nowhere else to go. She tested him one final time, though he did not know it. One evening, she spoke casually of selling the land someday, of moving somewhere smaller, less demanding. She watched his reaction carefully. He did not argue or protest. He nodded thoughtfully, saying only that whatever she chose, he would help make it possible. That night, Marta sat alone on the porch, listening to the road. The air was cool, carrying the promise of change. She thought of the child she had once lifted from the roadside, of the man who now slept under her roof. She thought of the silence she had endured and the patience it had required. When she rose, she felt a clarity she had not known in years. The test, she realized, was nearly complete. What remained was not judgment, but choice. The morning Marta chose to speak came without ceremony. There was no dramatic sign in the sky, no sudden clarity announced by thunder or light. It arrived the way most important moments in her life had arrived, quietly, carried on routine. She rose before dawn, as she always did, washed her face with cool water, dressed in clean but simple clothes, and stepped outside while the world was still half asleep. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp soil and distant fields. The road lay empty, its surface pale in the early light. Marta stood for a moment on the porch, letting the stillness settle inside her. She felt calm, not because she expected ease, but because she had reached a point where avoidance no longer served any purpose. Her son was already awake. She noticed him through the window, sitting at the small kitchen table with a cup of water, staring at nothing in particular. He had begun waking early again, falling naturally into the rhythm of the place, no longer forcing himself to sleep past the sunrise as he had during the first days of his return. There was a quiet attentiveness in his movements now, a patience that had not existed before. They worked together that morning as they had for weeks. The tasks were familiar, almost comforting. They harvested what remained in the garden, sorted produce, prepared the stand by the roadside. Marta watched him out of the corner of her eye, noting how his movements had grown surer, more efficient. He no longer hesitated before lifting heavy crates or adjusting the canopy ropes. His body had adapted, but more importantly, so had his mind. When the sun climbed higher and the stand was ready, Marta told him to stay behind and mind it for a while. It was not a request, it was a test of trust, subtle but deliberate. He nodded without hesitation, positioning himself where customers could see him easily. She left him there and walked back toward the house, her pace unhurried. Inside, she sat at the kitchen table and opened the drawer she rarely touched. From beneath folded cloths and old papers, she took out a thin folder. It was not elegant, nor did it announce its importance. It contained copies of documents she had studied countless times in silence. Marta closed the drawer carefully, as if to preserve the ordinary life it represented, and carried the folder with her when she stepped back outside. The stand was busy when she returned. A few cars had stopped, and her son handled the exchanges calmly, respectfully. Marta watched him interact with strangers, noticed the absence of embarrassment, the ease with which he spoke. He did not rush or apologize for the simplicity of the setup. He treated each customer as someone worthy of attention. When the flow slowed, Marta approached and asked him to join her in the shade beside the house. He followed, wiping his hands on a cloth, curiosity flickering briefly across his face. They sat on the low bench near the wall, the same one where he had once waited for her as a child while she finished her work. Marta held the folder in her lap for a long moment before opening it. She did not rush her words. She spoke calmly, explaining how the lawyer had found her, how the distant cousin had died, how the inheritance had come to her without warning or preparation. She spoke of the months that had followed, of her decision to change nothing, of her choice to remain silent. Her son listened without interrupting. As her words settled into meaning, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to something deeper and more painful. He looked away briefly toward the road, as if needing distance to absorb what he was hearing. When she finished, the silence between them felt different from all the others they had shared. It was not tense or guarded. It was heavy with realization. He turned back to her, his eyes unsteady, and shook his head slowly. The truth struck him with brutal clarity. He understood instantly what she had done and why. He saw the mirror her silence had held up to him, the way his return could now be questioned, examined from angles he had not wanted to consider. Shame rose sharply in his chest, not because of the money itself, but because of what its existence revealed about his past choices. Marta watched him carefully. She saw the conflict play out across his face, the urge to speak, and the restraint that held him back. She waited. She had waited years already. A few more moments cost her nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, stripped of defensiveness. He told her that the knowledge changed nothing about why he had come back. He did not deny that desperation had played a role, but he did not pretend it was the whole truth. He admitted how far he had strayed, how easily he had allowed success to rewrite his values. He spoke of regret without dramatics, of understanding earned too late but not without meaning. Marta listened, her expression steady. She did not interrupt to correct or comfort. When he finished, she placed the folder back on her lap and closed it. She told him that she believed him now, not because of his words, but because of the weeks he had spent working beside her without complaint, without knowledge of what she possessed. She explained that she had not withheld the truth to punish him, but to protect what remained between them from being corrupted by expectation or need. She told him she would help him, not in a way that erased consequence or restored illusions of the life he had lost, but in a way that allowed him to rebuild with humility and responsibility. She would help him settle his most dangerous debts, give him space to breathe again, but she would not buy back the world that had rejected him. That work, she said, belonged to him alone. More than that, she set conditions that had nothing to do with money. She spoke of presence, of consistency, of remembering that connection required effort even when life felt full elsewhere. She told him she did not want grand gestures or promises shaped by guilt. She wanted calls made without obligation, visits planned without crisis, respect offered without calculation. Her son accepted these terms without resistance. He did not bargain or justify himself. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that what she was offering was not rescue, but partnership. In the days that followed, their life adjusted again, this time with intention. The money began to move quietly, directed where it was needed and nowhere else. No one in the town noticed any dramatic change. Marta insisted on it. The stand remained by the road. The garden continued to demand care. The house stayed modest, its improvements practical rather than visible. Her son began to plan a future that did not rely on escape. He explored ways to build something small and honest nearby, something rooted in effort rather than image. He spoke of learning rather than leading, of patience rather than speed. Marta listened, offering guidance when asked, restraint when not. One evening, as the sun set low and painted the sky in muted colors, they sat together on the porch. The road stretched out before them, familiar and unthreatening. Cars passed occasionally, but Marta no longer followed them with her eyes. The pull they once held had weakened. She felt older, yes, but also lighter. The weight she had carried alone for so long had shifted, redistributed into something shared. The wealth she possessed now felt defined not by numbers or accounts, but by the quiet certainty that she was no longer unseen. Her son sat beside her, present in a way he had not been since childhood. There was no urgency in him now, no restless hunger for elsewhere. He had learned, through loss, what Marta had always known. That dignity did not come from leaving, and love did not diminish with simplicity. As night settled in and the world grew still, Marta closed her eyes briefly and breathed in the cool air. The road had taken much from her over the years, but in the end it had returned what mattered most. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. More powerful, emotional stories about life, family, and unexpected truths are coming next. Watch our other videos to discover stories that make you think, feel, and see life differently. And if this story mattered to you,